They say old cowboys never truly retire, but retired Air Force Colonel James Hawk Harrison never expected his homecoming to the Cedar Creek Rodeo to turn into an all-out war that would leave 7 custom Harleys scattered across the arena dirt. The man they called the Rattler learned the hard way about the difference between bullying small-town folks and facing a combat-hardened veteran. But to understand how it all went down, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we dive into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you enjoy stories of justice being served, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got another incredible tale waiting for you tomorrow. Now, let's begin. James Harrison stood motionless at the weathered entrance of Cedar Creek Rodeo Grounds, his boots planted firmly in the Texas soil he'd known since childhood. The setting sun cast long shadows across the empty arena, painting the weathered grandstands in shades of amber and gold. 26 years of Air Force service had honed his instincts to razor sharpness, and right now, every combat-trained nerve in his body screamed that something was terribly wrong. The rodeo grounds felt different, tense like a coiled rattlesnake ready to strike. The usual buzz of activity that preceded the annual county fair was noticeably absent. No ranch hands preparing the arena, no carnival workers setting up rides, no excited chatter of livestock handlers. Even the familiar whinnying of horses was missing from the nearby stables. The creak of the old wooden gate brought a flood of memories. James had fixed that same gate countless times during his high school years, back when he worked summers as a junior rodeo hand. After his parents' ranch went under during the drought of '95, old Jack Murphy, the former rodeo manager, had taken him under his wing, teaching him everything from barrel racing to bronc riding. Now that familiar creak announced his homecoming, but Jack wasn't here to welcome him. Cancer had taken him 4 months ago while James was completing his final tour overseas. Inside the grounds, the air was thick with the scent of dust and disuse. James methodically surveyed the scene, an old habit from his days running aerial reconnaissance. Everything looked exactly as he remembered it. The sun-bleached wooden railings, the worn dirt of the arena, the faded championship banners still hanging in the rafters. But something felt off about the stillness. A deep rumble shattered the evening quiet, not the familiar sound of tractors or livestock trailers, but motorcycles, many of them. James moved to the shadow of the grandstand, watching as 5 riders roared through the main entrance, their chrome-laden machines deliberately loud. Their black leather vests bore a distinctive emblem, a coiled rattlesnake with blood-red eyes, its fangs bared for strike. The lead rider, a massive man with a graying beard and countless tattoos, turned his head as they passed. Even at a distance, his predatory smirk was unmistakable. James noted every detail with military precision. The gang colors, the modified weapons poorly concealed under their vests, the practiced way they surveyed their surroundings. These weren't just weekend riders looking for trouble. They were organized, disciplined, dangerous. A soft voice from behind pulled his attention away from the bikers. "Colonel Harrison? Thank the Lord you're finally here." Emma Murphy, Jack's widow and the current rodeo manager, stood in the shadow of the concession stand, nervously clutching her weathered cowboy hat. Her silver hair was tied back in a neat braid, but her hands trembled as she approached. "Your father's old friend, Jack. He tried to stop them," she whispered, glancing fearfully toward the retreating motorcycles. "He tried so hard." "Stop who, Emma?" James asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The sidewinders," she replied, her voice barely audible. "They moved into the county 6 months ago, started small, just showing up at events, causing trouble. But now—" She pulled up her sleeve, revealing dark bruises that had no place on a woman in her 70s. "They demand protection money from every vendor at the fair, every contestant in the rodeo. Jack refused to pay, said he wouldn't let criminals destroy everything we built here." James's jaw tightened, his fighter pilot's focus narrowing with laser precision. "Tell me everything." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the Texas sky, Emma painted a picture of systematic intimidation. The sidewinders, led by a man known as the Rattler, a former rodeo champion turned outlaw, had transformed the peaceful county fair circuit into their personal hunting ground. Small-time vendors paid protection money, competitors withdrew from events, and the local police seemed powerless or unwilling to help. Jack. Emma's voice cracked with emotion. He organized a meeting, tried to get the other rodeo managers to stand together, but after they burned down the Miller's feed store and crippled poor Tommy Chen's prized stallion, nobody dared resist anymore. The stress, the constant fear. It didn't help with his condition. James's hand clenched into a fist, his pilot's ring leaving an impression in his palm. He'd been flying combat missions over hostile territory while his mentor faced his own battle at home. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, the same weight he'd carried leading men into combat, making split-second decisions at Mach 2 with lives hanging in the balance. A police siren wailed in the distance, then quickly fell silent. Emma flinched at the sound. "They own some of the deputies," she explained, her voice bitter. "Reports disappear, evidence vanishes. Even the Texas Ranger who came to investigate suddenly got transferred. Now nobody will help us." "That changes today," James said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had steadied his squadron through countless missions. "Tell me about their operation. Everything you know." As the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, James knew this would be a different kind of battle than any he'd fought before. But whether at 30,000 feet or here on the ground, the principles remained the same. Gather intelligence, identify the enemy's weaknesses, and strike with overwhelming precision. The Sidewinders were about to learn that they'd picked the wrong fight in the wrong town. James Harrison parked his dusty Ford pickup in front of Emma Murphy's ranch house, the familiar scent of mesquite and desert sage floating through his open window. The evening sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden porch where he'd spent countless summers during his youth, learning the finer points of rodeo life from Jack Murphy. Now, 26 years of Air Force service later, he was back, not for a happy reunion, but to understand how his hometown had fallen into the grip of fear. The screen door creaked as Emma emerged, her silver hair catching the golden light. She carried 2 glasses of sweet tea, a ritual unchanged since James was a teenage ranch hand. But the tremor in her hands as she set the glasses down spoke volumes about how much else had changed. "The Sidewinders," Emma began, settling into her rocking chair. "They started showing up at local rodeos about 6 months ago, just watching at first. Then they began entering the competitions." She paused, her weathered fingers tightening around her glass. "That's when we met their leader, Marcus the Rattler Rodriguez." James listened intently, his military training kicking in as he mentally cataloged every detail. "Tell me about him." "Used to be a champion bull rider," Emma continued. "Won the state finals 3 years running back in the 90s. Then got caught fixing competitions, drugging horses. Banned for life from professional rodeo." She took a shaky sip of tea. "Now he runs the Sidewinders like it's his own personal revenge tour against the rodeo circuit that rejected him." A distant rumble of motorcycles carried across the ranch, and Emma's shoulders tensed visibly. James noticed how her eyes darted to the property line, checking for unwelcome visitors, a habit born of months living under threat. "How many in his crew?" James asked, his tactical mind already forming preliminary assessments. "Core group's about 15, Emma replied, "but they've got supporters all through the county. Police, local officials, even some judges. Your daddy's old friend, Sheriff Wilson? Retired early last month? Word is the Sidewinders made it clear his grandkid's safety couldn't be guaranteed if he kept asking questions." James's jaw tightened. He'd served in enough conflict zones to recognize the pattern, corruption spreading like a cancer, feeding on fear and silence. The isolation of these small Texas towns made them perfect targets for organized intimidation. A truck approached on the dirt road, and both James and Emma watched as old Bill Thompson's feed store delivery vehicle drove past. The "for sale" sign in its window told another story of the Sidewinders' impact on the community. "Bill's selling?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma nodded grimly. After they burned his feed store, he tried rebuilding. Then they started threatening his suppliers, sabotaging deliveries. Last week, his youngest grandson got roughed up after school. The message was clear: sell and leave, or worse would follow. James stood, walking to the porch railing. His trained eye surveyed the landscape, noting defensive positions, approaches, vulnerabilities. It wasn't so different from analyzing combat zones from the cockpit of his F-15. "The county fair starts next week," Emma continued. He organized a meeting, tried to get the other rodeo managers to stand together. But after they burned down the Miller's feed store and crippled poor Tommy Chen's prized stallion, nobody dared resist anymore. The stress, the constant fear, it didn't help with his condition. James's hand clenched into a fist, his pilot's ring leaving an impression in his palm. He'd been flying combat missions over hostile territory, while his mentor faced his own battle at home. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, the same weight he'd carried leading men into combat, making split-second decisions at Mach 2 with lives hanging in the balance. A police siren wailed in the distance, then quickly fell silent. Emma flinched at the sound. "They own some of the deputies," she explained, her voice bitter. "Reports disappear, evidence vanishes. Even the Texas Ranger who came to investigate suddenly got transferred. Now nobody will help us." "That changes today," James said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had steadied his squadron through countless missions. "Tell me about their operation, everything you know." As the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, James knew this would be a different kind of battle than any he'd fought before. But whether at 30,000 feet or here on the ground, the principles remained the same. Gather intelligence, identify the enemy's weaknesses, and strike with overwhelming precision. The Sidewinders were about to learn that they'd picked the wrong fight in the wrong town. K-Generate Part 2. Remember, every part should contain 1,100 words. Here's Part 2. Protagonist's entry, 1,100 words. James Harrison parked his dusty Ford pickup in front of Emma Murphy's ranch house, the familiar scent of mesquite and desert sage floating through his open window. The evening sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden porch, where he'd spent countless summers during his youth, learning the finer points of rodeo life from Jack Murphy. Now, 26 years of Air Force service later, he was back, not for a happy reunion, but to understand how his hometown had fallen into the grip of fear. The screen door creaked as Emma emerged, her silver hair catching the golden light. She carried 2 glasses of sweet tea, a ritual unchanged since James was a teenage ranch hand. But the tremor in her hands as she set the glasses down spoke volumes about how much else had changed. "The Sidewinders," Emma began, settling into her rocking chair. "They started showing up at local rodeos about 6 months ago, just watching at first. Then they began entering the competitions." She paused, her weathered fingers tightening around her glass. "That's when we met their leader, Marcus the Rattler Rodriguez." James listened intently, his military training kicking in as he mentally cataloged every detail. "Tell me about him." "Used to be a champion bull rider," Emma continued. "Won the state finals 3 years running back in the 90s, then got caught fixing competitions, drugging horses, banned for life from professional rodeo." She took a shaky sip of tea. "Now he runs the Sidewinders like it's his own personal revenge tour against the rodeo circuit that rejected him." A distant rumble of motorcycles carried across the ranch, and Emma's shoulders tensed visibly. James noticed how her eyes darted to the property line, checking for unwelcome visitors, a habit born of months living under threat. "How many in his crew?" James asked, his tactical mind already forming preliminary assessments. "Core group's about 15, Emma replied, "but they've got supporters all through the county, police, local officials, even some judges. Your daddy's old friend, Sheriff Wilson, retired early last month. Word is the Sidewinders made it clear his grandkid's safety couldn't be guaranteed if he kept asking questions." James's jaw tightened. He'd served in enough conflict zones to recognize the pattern, corruption spreading like a cancer, feeding on fear and silence. The isolation of these small Texas towns made them perfect targets for organized intimidation. A truck approached on the dirt road, and both James and Emma watched as old Bill Thompson's feed store delivery vehicle drove past. The for sale sign in its window told another story of the Sidewinders' impact on the community. "Bill's selling?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma nodded grimly. After they burned his feed store, he tried rebuilding. Then they started threatening his suppliers, sabotaging deliveries. Last week, his youngest grandson got roughed up after school. The message was clear: sell and leave, or worse would follow. James stood, walking to the porch railing. His trained eye surveyed the landscape, noting defensive positions, approaches, vulnerabilities. It wasn't so different from analyzing combat zones from the cockpit of his F-15. The county fair starts next week, Emma continued. Usually our biggest event of the year, but the Rattler's demanding triple the usual protection fees from all vendors. Says prices go up when people don't show proper respect. A flash of movement caught James's attention. 3 motorcycles had stopped at the end of Emma's driveway, their riders watching the house with predatory interest. James recognized their leader from the rodeo grounds earlier, a massive man with a graying beard and the Sidewinder's rattlesnake emblem prominently displayed on his leather vest. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. That's Snake Eyes, the Rattler's enforcer. Ex-con, did time for aggravated assault. Now he handles collections for the gang. James watched as Snake Eyes made a show of writing something in a small notebook, then deliberately tore out the page and let it flutter in the wind. The message was clear. They were watching, making sure Emma understood her vulnerability. They do this often? James asked quietly. Every few days. Different times, different riders. Just letting me know they can come whenever they want. Emma's voice cracked slightly. Jack used to sit out here with his shotgun. Said he'd rather die standing than live on his knees. Now he's gone and I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The motorcycles roared away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and fear. James's combat-trained mind was already processing everything he'd learned, forming the beginnings of a strategy. He'd seen this type of intimidation before, in villages across Afghanistan and Iraq, brutal men exploiting isolated communities, using fear as a weapon. Emma, he said finally, I need you to tell me about everyone who stood up to them. Everyone who's been hurt, threatened, or driven away. And most importantly, I need to know about those who might still have the courage to fight back if they knew they weren't alone. She looked at him, hope warring with fear in her eyes. James, these aren't troubled teens or rowdy bikers. They're organized, connected. They've hurt people, killed people if the rumors are true. This isn't like your wars overseas. No, James agreed, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had steadied fellow pilots through the worst combat situations. This is more important. This is home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Emma's ranch, James Harrison began to plan. 26 years in the Air Force had taught him that victory wasn't just about superiority in combat. It was about precision, timing, and the courage to act when others wouldn't. The Sidewinders had brought their brand of terror to his hometown, thinking they'd found another easy target. They were about to learn they'd made a serious mistake. Emma spent the next hour detailing the Sidewinders' systematic takeover of Cedar Creek's rodeo circuit. James took mental notes with military precision, mapping out the gang's pattern of intimidation that had transformed their peaceful county fair into a criminal enterprise. After Jack died, Emma continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The Rattler showed up at the funeral, called it paying respects, then told me my courtesy period of free protection was over, since my husband was no longer around to earn it. A truck engine rumbled outside, and both James and Emma tensed until they recognized Tommy Chen's battered pickup pulling up to the house. The former rodeo champion limped heavily as he climbed out, his right leg never having healed properly after the Sidewinder's accident. Colonel Harrison, Tommy called out, his voice carrying a mix of relief and urgency. Heard you were back in town. We need to talk. He glanced nervously over his shoulder before climbing the porch steps. The Sidewinders, they're planning something big for the county fair, something worse than their usual shakedowns. James studied the younger man, a former bronc riding champion he remembered as a fearless teenager, now moving with the cautious steps of someone who'd learned the hard cost of defiance. Tell me everything, Tommy. They're bringing in riders from other chapters, Tommy explained, settling stiffly into a chair. Not just for intimidation. The Rattlers setting up illegal betting operations, rigging competitions. Anyone who doesn't play along? He gestured to his mangled leg. Well, accidents happen in rodeo, right? A police cruiser rolled past Emma's ranch, moving deliberately slow. James noted the vehicle number and the driver's careful attention to the house. Another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Your accident, James said quietly. Tell me about it. Tommy's face darkened. Was practicing for the state finals. My horse, finest quarter horse in 3 counties, suddenly went crazy in the arena. Found out later someone had injected her with stimulants. She threw me then. He swallowed hard. They had to put her down. Sheriff Wilson tried investigating, but evidence disappeared. Vet who did the autopsy suddenly retired and moved away. Emma touched Tommy's shoulder gently. Show him the rest. With shaking hands, Tommy pulled out his phone, displaying a text message. Hope your new horse has better insurance. Shame if something happened to your kid's pony, too. The Rattler sends his regards. James's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough combat to recognize psychological warfare when he saw it. The Sidewinders weren't just criminals. They were systematically breaking down the community's will to resist. They're targeting the youth rodeo program next, Tommy continued, telling parents their kids can only compete if they place bets through the gang. Some families are pulling out. Others are going along just to protect their children. The Rattler says he's teaching the next generation how things really work. A distant rumble of motorcycles carried across the darkening Texas landscape. Tommy instinctively shifted away from the windows, while Emma's hands moved to adjust curtains that were already drawn. Your father, James said to Emma. Jack knew about the betting scheme? Emma nodded, tears welling in her eyes. He was gathering evidence, working with a Texas Ranger named Martinez. Then the Ranger got transferred, and that same week, she couldn't finish the sentence. The cancer didn't kill Jack, Tommy said flatly. The stress of fighting them, watching them destroy everything he loved, that's what really did it. And now they're going to do the same thing to the whole county fair circuit. James stood, moving to the window with the practiced casualness of someone used to hostile surveillance. In the gathering dusk, he could make out 2 motorcycles parked at the far end of Emma's drive, their riders pretending to check their engines while keeping the house under observation. The county fair starts in 5 days, Tommy said. Word is, the Rattler's bringing in some real hard cases from his old prison days. Not just for muscle. They're planning something big, something that'll let them take control of every rodeo event in the state. How many honest people left in law enforcement? James asked, his tactical mind already formulating strategies. Deputy Sarah Chen, Emma offered. She worked with Jack on trying to expose them, and maybe a few others, but they're scared. The Sidewinders have dirt on everyone, real or manufactured. James nodded, processing the information with the same precision he'd used planning combat missions. The pattern was clear. The gang had identified an isolated community with limited law enforcement resources, then systematically exploited every vulnerability. Colonel, Tommy said hesitantly, I know that look. You're planning something, but these aren't insurgents or enemy fighters. The Rattler, he enjoys hurting people, and he's got friends in high places. So, did every warlord and terrorist cell I ever faced, James replied quietly. They all thought they were untouchable too. They all learned differently. A text message lit up Tommy's phone. Nice chat with the colonel. Hope you remembered to warn him about visiting hours at the cemetery. Hate for him to miss saying goodbye to old friends. James read the message with cold fury building behind his eyes. In that moment, watching Emma's hands shake as she clutched her husband's old rodeo belt buckle, seeing Tommy unconsciously rub his crippled leg, he made a decision. Tommy, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had steadied pilots through the worst firefights. I need you to tell me everything you know about their operation. Every member, every connection, every detail you've noticed. Emma, I need Jack's old files. Anything he was gathering for the Rangers. They'll kill you, Emma whispered. No, James replied, watching the Sidewinder's observers finally ride away into the darkness. They'll try, but they're about to learn the difference between terrorizing civilians and taking on someone who spent their life studying how to dismantle organizations like theirs. This ends now. James checked his watch in the fading Texas twilight, almost time for the evening rodeo practice. Through his tactical surveillance position behind the old concession stand, he watched 3 Sidewinders motorcycles circle the arena, their engines deliberately loud as young riders tried to practice their barrel racing. Sarah Chen, the only deputy he truly trusted, had confirmed his suspicions. The Sidewinders weren't just running a protection racket. They were systematically taking over the entire rodeo circuit. Tonight's practice session would reveal just how deep their influence ran. "They're here early," Tommy whispered, crouching beside James. "The Rattler usually sends Snake Eyes to collect their fees after practice." James noted the unusual pattern. His years of aerial reconnaissance had taught him that changes in enemy behavior often signaled bigger operations in play. How many riders signed up for tonight's practice? "Only 6, Tommy replied grimly. "Used to be 20 or 30, but after what happened to my horse..." He left the sentence unfinished. The screech of brakes cut through the evening air as a black SUV pulled up to the arena entrance. The man who stepped out moved with the arrogant confidence of someone used to being feared. Even at this distance, James could see why they called him the Rattler. Everything about him suggested a predator poised to strike. "That's new," Tommy muttered. "The Rattler never shows up for practice sessions." James watched as the Rattler approached young Katie Williams, a 16-year-old barrel racing champion. The gang leader's voice carried across the arena. "Heard you're entering the state finals next month. Shame if something happened to affect your qualifying times." Katie's father stepped forward, but froze as Snake Eyes and another Sidewinder moved to flank him. The message was clear: resist, and consequences would follow. "Just making sure everyone understands the new arrangement," the Rattler continued smoothly. "All competition entries go through us now. We handle the betting, we set the odds, we decide who places where. Think of it as career management." James had seen enough. He keyed his radio, speaking quietly to Deputy Chen. "You getting this?" "Every word," Chen's voice crackled back. "But the Rattler's too smart to make direct threats. We need more." James watched as the Rattler moved down the line of young riders, each conversation following the same pattern: veiled threats wrapped in fake concern. The gang leader was practiced, careful with his words, never quite crossing the line into explicit criminality. A commotion near the stables caught his attention. 2 Sidewinders were roughing up old Pete Martinez, the groundskeeper who'd worked the rodeo for 30 years. "You're late with your stable rental fees," one biker growled. "The Rattler says prices go up for disrespect." James had seen enough. 26 years of military service had taught him the importance of choosing the right moment to engage. This wasn't it, not yet. But watching Pete Martinez stumble under the bikers' pushes, he knew the time for reconnaissance was ending. "They're getting bolder," Tommy whispered. "Used to be they'd at least wait until dark." James nodded grimly. "They think they're untouchable. That's their first mistake." He keyed his radio again. "Chen, I need everything you've got on their operation. Every connection, every corrupt official, every rigged competition." "Already working on it," Chen replied. "But Colonel, they've got pictures of my family. Said they'd make sure my kids never felt safe at school again if I didn't play along." "That ends today," James stated firmly. Through his binoculars, he watched the Rattler conclude his rounds of intimidation. The gang leader moved with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real resistance. Katie Williams and her father hurried past James's position, their faces tight with fear. James stepped out, causing them to startle. "Mr. Williams," he said quietly. "A moment." Williams looked nervously toward the Rattler, then back to James. "I can't. They'll destroy everything anyway," James finished. "Unless we stop them. But I need your help." Williams hesitated, then straightened slightly. "The military taught you how to fight people like this?" The Air Force taught me something better, James replied. It taught me how to win wars, not with brute force, but with precision, planning, and the right people standing together. A low rumble of motorcycles announced more Sidewinders arriving. James watched as they took up positions around the arena, a show of force meant to remind everyone who controlled the rodeo now. Tomorrow night, James told Williams quietly. There's a meeting at Emma Murphy's ranch. Spread the word, but carefully. Only people you trust completely. Williams nodded almost imperceptibly, then hurried away with his daughter. James returned to his observation post, continuing to document the Sidewinders' operation with military precision. The Rattler's voice carried across the arena again, this time directed at a young bull rider. Remember, boy, you draw the bull we tell you to draw. You ride how we tell you to ride. Or maybe you'll end up like Tommy Chen, if you're lucky. James's jaw tightened. He'd seen this pattern before in war zones. Terrorists and warlords who thought fear gave them absolute power. They never understood that fear had limits. Push people too far, threaten their children, destroy their way of life, and eventually, they'd find the courage to fight back. The sun was setting over the Texas horizon as James finally left his observation post. He had what he needed: patterns, names, connections. Tomorrow he'd begin transforming a broken community into a force capable of defending itself. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. War heroes die just like anyone else, Colonel. The Rattler sends his regards. James smiled grimly as he typed his response. So do snakes, especially when they bite off more than they can handle. The war for Cedar Creek's soul was about to begin. But this time, the bullies and criminals who thought they ruled through fear were about to learn what real power looked like. The power of a community united behind someone who'd spent their life learning how to defeat enemies far more dangerous than them. The meeting at Emma Murphy's ranch drew a larger crowd than James expected. They gathered in the old barn, speaking in hushed voices, casting nervous glances at the entrance where Tommy Chen and two other veterans stood watch. James recognized faces from his youth: ranchers, rodeo performers, business owners, all bearing the worn look of people who'd lived too long under threat. Deputy Chen arrived last, parking her patrol car well away from the barn. Had to make sure I wasn't followed, she explained, handing James a thick folder. Everything I could gather on the Sidewinders' operation. Bank records, property deeds, police reports that mysteriously disappeared. James spread the documents across a makeshift table, an old barn door laid across hay bales. With methodical precision, he began mapping the gang's infrastructure on a large whiteboard, creating a tactical diagram that would have looked at home in any military briefing room. The Sidewinders aren't just a gang, he explained to the gathered crowd. They're running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Protection rackets, illegal betting, competition fixing. It's all connected, but that complexity makes them vulnerable. Vulnerable? Bill Thompson scoffed from the back. They've got half the county in their pocket. My feed store's gone, my grandson's still wearing a cast, and nobody did a damn thing. Because they were alone, James replied calmly. Isolated. That's how organizations like this work. They pick off targets one by one. But look at this. He pointed to his diagram. Every threat, every act of violence, every rigged competition creates evidence. Deputy Chen's been gathering it. Others too. Now we put it all together. Katie Williams's father stepped forward. They threatened my daughter today. Said they'd make sure she never rode again if we didn't play along with their betting scheme. James nodded grimly. Add it to the pattern. Names, dates, exact words used. Every threat builds our case. He turned to Deputy Chen. Your FBI contact still reliable? Agent Martinez? Yes, but she needs more. Solid evidence linking the Rattler directly to criminal acts. Right now, it's all circumstantial. James switched to another section of his diagram. That's where we start. The Sidewinders think they're smart, keeping their leader insulated, but they've got three major vulnerabilities. He pointed to specific nodes in his tactical map: their money flow, their communication patterns, and their need to maintain fear. How do we exploit those? Tommy asked, limping over to study the diagram. First, we document everything. Every threat, every payment, every corrupt official. Build a pattern too big to ignore or cover up. Second, we set up our own surveillance network. They watch us. We watch them. But better. Emma Murphy spoke up from where she sat clutching Jack's old rodeo belt buckle. They'll retaliate. Hurt more people. They'll try, James agreed. But not if we move first. The county fair starts in 4 days. That's when they're bringing in their heavy hitters, expanding their betting operation. It's also when they're most exposed. He outlined his strategy with the same precision he'd used planning combat missions. Each person would have a role, each movement choreographed, each contingency planned for. The Sidewinders had spent months creating a network of fear. James would show them how quickly fear could turn to strength when people stood together. Tommy, I need you coordinating with the honest competitors. Document every attempt at race fixing, every threat. Mr. Williams, your construction company's security cameras. How many can you spare? Got a whole warehouse full of new ones. Was going to install them at that casino project before the Sidewinders ran us off the job. Perfect. Deputy Chen, you'll coordinate with Agent Martinez. Emma, your ranch becomes our command center. The Sidewinders watch it anyway. Let's use that to our advantage. As James continued outlining the operation, he saw something change in the gathered faces. Fear began giving way to determination, isolation to unity. These were Texas rodeo people. Tough, proud, independent. They'd been caught off guard by the Sidewinders' systematic takeover, but they weren't broken. His secure phone buzzed. Another text from the Rattler. Nice meeting you're having. Shame if there was a fire. Old barns burn easy. James showed the message to Deputy Chen, who added it to her evidence file. They're watching, she whispered. Good, James replied. Let them watch. Let them think they know what we're planning. Meanwhile, he switched to a different section of his diagram, showing a complex web of financial transactions Tommy Chen had discovered. The Sidewinders aren't just criminals. They're businessmen. They've invested their illegal profits in legitimate enterprises. Hotels, construction companies, even some of the rodeo grounds themselves. All purchased through shell companies, all connected to their money laundering operation. How does that help us? Bill Thompson asked. Because money leaves trails. Every transaction, every property deal, every rigged bet creates documentation. We're not just gathering evidence of crimes. We're mapping their entire organization. And organizations like this? James smiled grimly. They fall apart real quick when their infrastructure crumbles. As the meeting concluded, James watched the participants leave in small groups, careful not to draw attention. Each carried a piece of the plan. Each understood their role in what was to come. The Sidewinders thought they were watching a desperate community's last attempt at resistance. They were actually watching the beginning of their own downfall. Deputy Chen lingered behind, studying James's tactical diagram. You really think this will work? These aren't insurgents or enemy combatants. They're Americans, using our own systems against us. That's their weakness, James replied. They think operating on American soil makes them safer. They never learned the most important lesson from my time in combat. The bigger and more complex an operation becomes, the more vulnerabilities it creates. Outside, the Texas night was alive with cricket song and distant coyote calls. James watched the last participants drive away, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The Sidewinders were about to learn that they hadn't just threatened a community. They'd awakened a warrior who understood that some battles weren't fought with weapons, but with the unbreakable spirit of people who'd finally found the courage to stand together. The first confrontation came sooner than James expected. He stood at the Cedar Creek Rodeo entrance the next morning, watching Snake Eyes and two other Sidewinders harass young Bobby Chen, Tommy's 16-year-old son, as the boy tried to lead his horse to practice. Your daddy never learned his lesson, Snake Eyes sneered, deliberately blocking the boy's path. Maybe you're smarter. Shame if this pretty horse had an accident like your old man's did. James moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent decades in combat situations. His boots made no sound on the packed dirt as he positioned himself between Bobby and the bikers. "Morning, gentlemen. Bit early for social calls." Snake Eyes turned, his surprise quickly masked by practiced intimidation. "Well, if it ain't the hero, heard you been asking questions, making plans. The Rattler says that's bad for business." "Really?" James replied calmly. "Tell me more about your business. The illegal betting, the rigged competitions, or maybe the money laundering through those shell companies you think nobody knows about?" The larger biker's face darkened. "You're playing a dangerous game, Colonel. War heroes die just like anyone else." "True," James agreed, "but soldiers learn things civilians don't, like how to gather intelligence, document patterns, build cases that can't be buried or intimidated away." He turned slightly to Bobby. "Go on, son. Practice starts in 10 minutes. The boy hesitated, then led his horse past the bikers. James noted how Snake Eye's hand twitched toward his vest, where a concealed weapon likely waited. But they were being watched. Deputy Chen's patrol car sat visible in the parking lot, her dashboard camera recording everything. "You think a few cameras scare us?" Snake Eyes laughed, but James caught the uncertainty in his eyes. "We own this county. Do you?" James stepped closer, his voice pitched low. "Then why are your hands shaking? Real killers. They don't telegraph their moves like amateur hour thugs. You're used to terrorizing civilians. Now you're facing someone who studied people like you, who knows exactly how organizations like yours fall apart." Snake Eyes swung without warning, a heavy right hook meant to end the conversation permanently. But James had read his body language, anticipated the attack. He stepped inside the punch, using the biker's momentum to send him sprawling in the dirt. The other two sidewinders moved to intervene, but Deputy Chen's car door opened, the sound of her shotgun racking a shell freezing them in place. "That's assault on a civilian," Chen called out. "Want to add resisting arrest?" Snake Eyes picked himself up, trying to maintain his intimidating facade. "This ain't over, Colonel." "Not by a long shot." "Actually," James replied calmly, "it is. You just don't know it yet. Tell the Rattler I look forward to our conversation about his creative accounting practices, especially those interesting transfers through the Cayman Islands." The bikers retreated to their motorcycles, their attempt at intimidation thoroughly deflated. James watched them roar away, noting how Snake Eyes kept glancing back, no longer with threat, but with the first hints of real fear. Bobby Chen approached hesitantly. "Colonel Harrison? Thank you, first period. I was scared they'd hurt my horse." "No more of that," James assured him. "Things are changing around here, starting today." Deputy Chen joined them, holstering her shotgun. "Got it all on camera, plus a clear shot of the concealed weapons they're carrying. Want me to run the plates on their bikes?" "Not yet," James replied. "Let them report back first. The Rattler needs to understand he's not dealing with scared civilians anymore." Throughout the morning, James watched the ripple effects of the confrontation spread through Cedar Creek. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by noon the story had grown to near mythic proportions. The fearsome Snake Eyes laid out in the dirt by the returned Air Force colonel. Tommy Chen arrived at the practice arena, moving quickly despite his injured leg. "Heard what happened with Bobby. The whole town's talking about it." "Good," James replied. "Fear works both ways. The sidewinders relied on people being too scared to stand up. Now they're learning what real strength looks like." His phone buzzed, the Rattler's number. "Impressive moves, Colonel. But you just signed death warrants for everyone you care about. Some lessons need to be taught the hard way." James showed the message to Deputy Chen, who added it to her evidence file. "They're getting sloppy," she observed, "making direct threats now. The Rattler usually keeps his hands cleaner than this." "Because he's scared," James explained. "For the first time, someone's pushing back effectively. Organizations like the Sidewinders, they're not used to real resistance, makes them emotional, prone to mistakes." By evening, more changes became apparent. The usual Sidewinders patrols through town were conspicuously absent. Their regular collection visits to local businesses didn't happen. Instead, groups of bikers gathered at their usual haunts, clearly discussing new strategies. James watched it all through the surveillance network they'd established, noting every pattern change, every sign of disruption to their usual operation. The Sidewinders thought they were regrouping. Actually, they were revealing their entire command structure. "They'll hit back hard," Tommy warned as they reviewed security footage. "The Rattler can't let this challenge go unanswered." "I'm counting on it," James replied. "But first, they'll try to reassert control, probably at tomorrow's youth rodeo practice. That's when we'll be ready with Phase 2. He studied the tactical displays showing Sidewinder movements across Cedar Creek. The gang thought they were preparing a counterattack. They didn't realize they were walking into a carefully planned trap, one that would use their own methods of intimidation against them. The war for Cedar Creek's soul had begun, and James Harrison intended to show these criminals the difference between bullying civilians and facing someone who'd spent his life learning how to dismantle organizations exactly like theirs. If you're enjoying this story of how one Air Force veteran stood up against corruption and showed these outlaw bikers the true meaning of courage, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got another incredible tale of justice served coming your way tomorrow. Also, let us know in the comments, what would you do if criminals tried to take over your hometown? Now back to how Colonel Harrison turned the tables on the Sidewinders. The Sidewinders' response came at dawn, exactly as James had predicted. 3 delivery trucks belonging to supportive businesses were found with their tires slashed. Mr. Williams's construction equipment had been vandalized, and Katie's prized barrel racing horse was missing from its stable, though it was later found unharmed, a clear warning of what could happen. "They're escalating," Deputy Chen reported, photographing the damage for her evidence file. "Hit 5 locations simultaneously. Professional job, no witnesses." James studied the pattern of attacks through his tactical lens. Not as professional as they think. Look at the timing, the targets chosen. They're reactive, emotional, making mistakes. His phone lit up with another message from the Rattler. "Just a taste, Colonel. Still think you can protect everyone? Tomorrow's youth rodeo practice should be interesting. Accidents happen after all." The threat was clear, but James had been waiting for it. He gathered his core team at Emma's ranch, where the barn had been transformed into a command center. Surveillance feeds showed Sidewinder movements across town, while detailed maps tracked their patterns of intimidation. "They're planning something big for tomorrow," James explained, pointing to specific locations. "But they don't realize we've got every angle covered. Tommy, update on the competitors?" "Most parents want to withdraw their kids," Tommy replied. "They're scared after what happened with Katie's horse." "Perfect," James said, surprising everyone. "That's exactly what we want them to think. The Sidewinders are expecting an empty arena, a show of their power, instead." He outlined his plan with military precision. Each team member had a role, each movement choreographed to expose the gang's operations. The Sidewinders thought fear was their greatest weapon. James would show them how quickly that weapon could backfire. Through the day, more pressure came. Small business owners reported threatening visits. Athletes received anonymous messages about upcoming accidents. The Sidewinders were following their usual playbook of escalating intimidation. "They're getting desperate," James noted, watching surveillance footage of Snake Eyes confronting a local vendor. "Look at his posture, his movements. He's scared, trying to hide it behind aggression." Deputy Chen nodded. "The Rattler's pushing them hard. My sources say he's furious about losing face after the incident with Bobby." "Good," James replied. "Angry people make mistakes. Big ones." Evening brought more warnings. 3 Sidewinders circled Emma's ranch repeatedly, making sure they were seen. Others parked outside supporters' homes, revving engines in the middle of the night. Classic intimidation tactics, but James noted how their usual precision had been replaced by almost frantic activity. "They're burning resources," he explained to his team. "Using too many people, too much visibility, creating evidence we can use." His secure phone buzzed, another message from the Rattler, this one different. "Last chance, Colonel. Meet me at midnight, Old Miller Barn. Come alone, we discuss terms. Or tomorrow, children bleed. James showed the message to Deputy Chen. He's breaking pattern, getting personally involved instead of working through intermediaries. It's a trap, Tommy warned. Of course it is, James agreed. But not for me. The Old Miller Barn stood dark against the Texas night sky as James approached on foot. His military training had taught him to recognize ambush points, and the Sidewinders had set this one up obviously. Too obviously. The Rattler waited inside, flanked by 4 bikers, including Snake Eyes. Their attempt at casual poses couldn't hide their combat readiness. James noted every position, every concealed weapon, every line of fire. Bold move coming alone, the Rattler said, his voice carrying forced confidence. Who said I came alone? On cue, floodlights blazed from multiple angles. Deputy Chen's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. This is the police. The building is surrounded. The Rattler's face contorted with rage. You think some lights in a cop show scare us? This changes nothing. Actually, James replied calmly, it changes everything. He held up his phone, showing a live stream of multiple locations. Right now, state police are raiding your headquarters. FBI teams are executing warrants at 7 locations. Every transaction, every threat, every criminal act. We've documented it all. You're bluffing, Snake Eyes snarled, but his hand shook as he reached for his weapon. Am I? James played a series of audio recordings, the Rattler's own voice detailing criminal operations, issuing threats, arranging fixes. Amazing what modern surveillance technology can do, especially when you're too busy watching us to watch yourselves. The Rattler's composed facade crackled. Kill him. But his men hesitated, seeing the red dots of laser sights appearing on their chests. The trap wasn't just police outside. Strategic positions had been prepared days in advance. Your choice, James said quietly. Surrender now, or find out what happens when you bring street tactics against military strategy. The fight ended before it truly began. The Sidewinders, facing overwhelming force and clear evidence of their crimes, surrendered with little resistance. The Rattler alone tried to fight, but his swing at James ended with him face down in the dirt. Deputy Chen's knee in his back as she applied handcuffs. You don't understand what you've done, the Rattler spat. We've got connections, judges in our pocket, politicians. Had, James corrected. Amazing how quickly corruption scatters when exposed to light. Check your phone, if you can find it. Your connections are running for cover, making deals to save themselves. Dawn broke over Cedar Creek to find the Sidewinders' empire in ruins. Their leaders arrested, their operations exposed, their network of corruption unraveling as former allies rushed to cooperate with authorities. But James knew the real victory wasn't in the arrests or the evidence. It was in the faces of the townspeople as they emerged to find their streets free of fear. It was in Bobby Chen's proud smile as he led his horse to practice, in Katie Williams' determined grip on her reins as she prepared for competition. The war for Cedar Creek's soul wasn't one with violence or superior force. It was one with intelligence, strategy, and the unbreakable spirit of a community that had finally found the courage to stand together against those who would rule through fear. The morning after the Rattler's arrest brought new challenges. James stood at the Cedar Creek Rodeo entrance, watching a steady stream of unfamiliar motorcycles rumbling into town. The Sidewinders might be in custody, but their allies from other chapters weren't about to let go of such profitable territory without a fight. They're coming from 3 states, Deputy Chen reported, spreading surveillance photos across the command center table. Road Devils from Oklahoma, Iron Legion from New Mexico, even some Dust Riders from Arizona, all claiming they're here for the county fair. James studied the images with tactical precision. How many? At least 40 riders so far, more expected. They're taking over the local motels, making sure they're seen. Sheriff's worried they'll try to fill the power vacuum. But James had anticipated this. The Sidewinders' fall would naturally attract other predators. That's why Phase 3 of his plan was already in motion. Tommy, he called to Chen's radio. Status on the rodeo grounds? Cameras are up, Colonel. Every entrance, every corner. Williams' construction crew worked through the night. Plus, we've got volunteers stationed at all key points. The surveillance network they'd established to trap the Sidewinders had been expanded, modernized. James watched multiple feeds showing the new arrivals, noting their formations, their patterns, their attempts at intimidation. "They're coordinating," he observed, pointing to specific screens. "See how they're positioning themselves? Military precision. These aren't just thugs." Deputy Chen nodded grimly. "Intel suggests some are ex-military themselves, probably why they were chosen for this operation." "Good," James replied, surprising her. "Then they'll understand exactly what they're walking into." Throughout the morning, the show of force continued. Bikers paraded through town, making sure residents saw their numbers, their weapons, their apparent immunity to law enforcement. Classic psychological warfare, meant to crush any hope that the Rattler's arrest had brought real change. James gathered his core team at Emma's ranch. The command center displays showed Cedar Creek virtually surrounded by hostile forces, but where others saw intimidation, he saw opportunity. "They think they're demonstrating strength," he explained, pointing to specific patterns. "Actually, they're showing us their entire command structure. Look, the Road Devils are taking the north sector, Iron Legion the south. They're dividing the territory before they've even taken it." "And that helps us how?" Tommy asked. "Because they're already competing with each other. These gangs aren't allies. They're rivals forced to cooperate, push the right pressure points." His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You took down the Sidewinders. Impressive. But this is different. This is war." James showed the message to Deputy Chen, who added it to her evidence file. "They're right about one thing," she said. "This is war. We're outnumbered, outgunned." "No," James corrected. "We're not fighting their kind of war. They expect violence, territory control, traditional gang tactics. Instead," he outlined his strategy, developed from years of military experience. The rival gangs thought they were facing a simple town resistance. They didn't realize they were walking into a carefully orchestrated operation. By afternoon, the first phase began. Health inspectors, honest ones this time, descended on the motels housing the bikers. Fire marshals appeared to check occupancy limits. Deputy Chen's patrols became constant, recording every violation, no matter how minor. "They'll fight back," Tommy warned. "Count on it," James agreed. "That's the point." The gang's response was predictable. Threats were made, officials intimidated, messages sent. But James had prepared for this, ensuring every interaction was documented, every threat recorded, every attempt at intimidation captured on multiple cameras. His phone lit up again. "Your bureaucratic harassment doesn't scare us. Tomorrow's county fair will run our way, or it won't run at all." James smiled grimly. They still didn't understand. The paperwork, the inspections, the constant police presence. It wasn't meant to drive them out. It was meant to make them angry, sloppy, prone to mistakes. Evening brought the first cracks in their alliance. Road Devils members clashed with Iron Legion over territory boundaries. Dust Riders complained about being muscled out of prime positions. The very precision of their military-style operation became its weakness, as each group fought to maintain their designated zones. "They're fracturing," James observed, watching the surveillance feeds. "Faster than expected." Deputy Chen nodded. "My sources say there's tension over how to handle the fair. Road Devils want to take control immediately. Iron Legion prefers subtle infiltration." "Perfect. Now for Phase 2. As night fell, James activated the next part of his plan. Legitimate vendors, backed by proper permits and licenses, began setting up their fair booths, many staffed by veterans from 3 counties, all volunteers coordinated through James's network. The gangs found their anticipated takeover points already occupied, legally and properly. Their usual tactics of intimidation met not with fear, but with cameras, documentation, and immediate police response. "They're getting frustrated," Tommy reported via radio. 3 separate confrontations already. But our people held their ground, everything recorded. "Keep the pressure on," James instructed. "Let them make mistakes." His phone buzzed one final time that night. "You think you're clever, Colonel. But tomorrow, we show you what real war looks like." James watched the message scroll across his screen, remembering similar threats from warlords and terrorist cells. They never understood that real warfare wasn't about brute force or numbers. It was about strategy, patience, and knowing exactly how to make your enemy defeat themselves. The rival gangs thought they were preparing to take over Cedar Creek. Actually, they were walking into a trap 3 levels deep, one that would use their own military precision and territorial ambitions against them. The war for Cedar Creek's future had entered a new phase, but this time, the defenders weren't just fighting for their town. They were showing these criminal organizations that sometimes the strongest weapon isn't a gun or a threat, but the unbreakable spirit of a community that refuses to be intimidated. The county fair's opening day dawned with an electric tension in the air. James watched from his command center as the rival biker gangs positioned themselves around the rodeo grounds, their attempted show of force obvious and clumsy to his military-trained eye. "Road Devils have taken the north parking lot," Deputy Chen reported. "Iron Legions controlling the main entrance. Dust Riders are circling the perimeter. They're making their move today." James studied the surveillance feeds, noting how the gang's military-style precision was already breaking down. Their supposedly coordinated occupation had gaps, overlaps, signs of increasing tension between groups. "Sir," Tommy's voice crackled over the radio, "we've got trouble at the competitor registration. Iron Legion's blocking access, demanding their own riders get priority spots." "Let them," James replied calmly. "In fact, make sure they get exactly what they want." The gang members were so focused on controlling the registration process, they didn't notice how every interaction was being recorded from multiple angles. Their threats, their intimidation attempts, their obvious competition fixing, all documented in high definition. By mid-morning, the fair was in full swing, but with a dangerous undercurrent. Bikers patrolled the grounds in force, making sure everyone saw their numbers, their weapons, their apparent control. But James noticed what they didn't: the strategic positioning of his own people, the constant documentation of every illegal act, the growing friction between rival groups. His phone buzzed, a message from the Road Devils leader. "Your security means nothing. We own this fair now. Stand down, or blood flows." James showed the message to Deputy Chen, adding it to their evidence file. The gangs still didn't understand they weren't facing a simple security operation. They were walking into a military-grade sting, with every move calculated to expose their entire criminal network. The first major incident came during the barrel racing qualifiers. 3 Iron Legion members tried to force Katie Williams to withdraw, making it clear her horse might have an accident if she competed. But Katie wasn't alone this time. "Problem here?" James asked, stepping out from behind the stands. His calm voice carried the weight of command that had steadied pilots through combat situations. The bikers turned, hands instinctively moving toward concealed weapons. But they froze at the sight of multiple camera lenses focused on them, Deputy Chen's patrol car rolling up, and several large cowboys, all veterans, casually surrounding the area. "Just having a friendly conversation," one biker mumbled, backing away. "Good," James replied. "Because threatening competitors, attempting to fix races, intimidating minors, those are federal crimes. Shame if someone had evidence of that." The incident marked a turning point. The gangs had expected to find easy targets, instead discovering a community prepared and coordinated. Their attempts at control were met with calm resistance, every illegal act documented, every threat recorded. By afternoon, the pressure began showing. Road Devils clashed with Iron Legion over betting territory. Dust Riders complained about being squeezed out of their assigned zones. The very military precision they'd tried to employ became their weakness. "They're cracking," Tommy observed from his observation post. "Fighting among themselves more than intimidating folks." James nodded, watching the surveillance feeds. Fear works both ways. They're used to being the ones causing it. Now they're feeling it themselves. His phone lit up with another threat. "You think you're winning? Wait till the main events. Hope you're ready for some real accidents. But James had anticipated this too. Each major competition was staffed with veterans, every access point monitored, every potential sabotage point watched. The gangs found their usual tactics blocked at every turn. The breaking point came during the bull riding finals. Road Devils attempted to force their rider into the top spot, only to find Iron Legion had the same plan. The confrontation exploded into violence, not against the townspeople, but between rival gangs. "Now," James commanded into his radio. Deputy Chen's voice boomed through the fairground speakers. "This is law enforcement. We have evidence of multiple felonies, including competition fixing, illegal gambling, and attempted assault. The facility is surrounded." The gang's reaction was predictable. They tried to flee, only to find every exit blocked by state police units that had been quietly positioning themselves throughout the day. Their military-style occupation became a trap, their own formations preventing effective escape. "You planned this," the Road Devils leader snarled as Deputy Chen applied handcuffs. "Set us against each other." "No," James replied calmly. "You did that yourselves. We just made sure everyone could see it." The roundup was comprehensive. Dozens of gang members arrested, their weapons seized, their illegal operations exposed. But more importantly, their aura of invincibility was shattered. As the last police transport pulled away, James watched families returning to the fairgrounds, children running freely, competitors preparing for events without fear. The gangs had thought they were fighting for territory. They never understood they were really fighting against the unbreakable spirit of a community that had found its courage. "Think they'll be back?" Tommy asked, watching the last bikers being processed by state police. "Some will try," James acknowledged. "Criminals always test defended territory, but they'll find something they don't expect." "What's that?" "A community that knows how to fight back. Not with violence or fear, but with unity, strategy, and the kind of strength that comes from standing together." His phone buzzed one final time, a message from an unknown number. "This isn't over, Colonel." James smiled, thinking of the comprehensive evidence they'd gathered, the criminal networks exposed, the corrupted officials being arrested across 3 states. The message was wrong. It was over. The gangs just didn't know it yet. Cedar Creek had changed. Where once there was fear, now there was determination. Where there was isolation, now there was unity. The war for the town's soul had been won not with guns or threats, but with the kind of strategic precision that only a lifetime of military service could teach. The aftermath of the county fair brought new challenges as Cedar Creek began to heal. James stood at the rodeo grounds entrance early that morning, watching young riders practice without fear for the first time in months. The absence of rumbling motorcycles and threatening figures was replaced by the natural sounds of a community reclaiming its heritage. "FBI's report came in," Deputy Chen said, joining him with fresh coffee. "They've connected the gangs to operations in 5 states. Our evidence helped break open cases they've been building for years." James nodded, studying the arena where Katie Williams was practicing her barrel racing, her movements fluid and confident. "And the local fallout?" 3 judges suspended pending investigation. 2 county commissioners resigned, even found corruption in the rodeo circuit management, officials who'd been taking bribes to overlook competition fixing. The cleansing extended beyond just Cedar Creek. As evidence from their operation spread, other communities began fighting back against similar criminal enterprises. James's phone had been buzzing constantly with requests for advice, strategy consultations, offers to testify in upcoming cases. Tommy Chen approached, walking with less of a limp now that proper medical treatment had replaced fear of retaliation. "Colonel, we've got some concerned folks at the community meeting. They're worried about reprisals, about other gangs seeing us as a target." "Show me," James replied, following Tommy to the old barn they'd used as their command center. Inside, familiar faces looked to him for answers. Business owners, competitors, families who'd stood together against the gangs. "What we did here," James began, addressing their fears directly, "wasn't just about driving out criminals. It was about building something stronger than any gang, a community that knows how to defend itself. He outlined the permanent changes they'd implemented, the surveillance network, the volunteer coordination systems, the direct lines to state and federal law enforcement. But more importantly, he emphasized the change in spirit. The gangs relied on isolation, on making each person feel alone and vulnerable. That's over now. We stand together. We watch out for each other. We document everything. No more silent victims. Emma Murphy spoke up from her usual corner. But what about the rumors? Other gangs talking about making examples of us? James smiled grimly. Let them try. Show them the intel we gathered just this morning. Deputy Chen activated the displays, showing surveillance footage of 3 separate gangs approaching Cedar Creek, then turning back after observing the community's new security measures. They're learning, James explained. Criminal organizations survive by calculating risk versus reward. We've changed that equation. The price of attacking Cedar Creek is now too high. Throughout the day, James worked with various groups, transforming their temporary defense measures into permanent community safeguards. The rodeo grounds security system was modernized, emergency response protocols were formalized, and most importantly, the network of mutual support was strengthened. His phone buzzed, a message from a familiar number. You've made powerful enemies, Colonel. Some wars don't end. But James noted the difference in tone. No specific threats, no immediate promises of violence, just vague warnings from diminished enemies trying to maintain their mystique. They're still watching us, Deputy Chen observed, reading the message. Good, James replied. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when a community decides it won't be victimized anymore. By afternoon, the rodeo grounds were hosting their first major event since the gang's defeat, a youth competition that had been canceled under the criminals' reign. James watched proud parents cheering on their children, vendors operating without fear of extortion, judges making calls based on skill rather than bribes. Tommy joined him in the observation post they'd maintained out of habit. Hard to believe how different it feels. Just a few weeks ago, this place was like a prison. Because people forgot something important, James said, watching Bobby Chen prepare for his first bull riding competition. They forgot that real strength isn't about causing fear. It's about standing together against it. His military experience had taught him that victory wasn't just about winning battles. It was about securing peace. Cedar Creek had won its war against the gangs, but maintaining that victory would require continued vigilance, unity, and the courage to stand together against any future threats. A state police cruiser pulled up, and Agent Martinez stepped out. Colonel Harrison? Got some news you should hear. We've been tracking chatter from other criminal organizations. Seems Cedar Creek's become something of a legend. The town that fought back. James nodded, unsurprised. They're studying us, trying to understand what went wrong with their usual tactics. Exactly. But here's the interesting part. Other communities are studying you, too. 3 towns in Oklahoma have already implemented similar defense measures. A rodeo circuit in New Mexico is using your documentation protocols. The ripple effects spread beyond just law enforcement. James watched as Cedar Creek's revival inspired neighboring communities. The very connectivity that gangs had once exploited to spread fear now carried messages of hope and resistance. His phone buzzed one final time that day, not a threat, but a message from Katie Williams's father. Bobby's about to ride. Whole town's here. Never thought we'd see this again. James stood in the crowd, watching the next generation reclaim their heritage without fear. The gangs had thought they were fighting for territory, for profit, for power. They never understood they were really fighting against something unbreakable, the spirit of a community that had rediscovered its strength. Cedar Creek had changed, not just in its security measures or organizational structures, but in its very soul. Where once there was fear, now there was determination. Where there was isolation, now there was unity. The war had been won not just with strategy and evidence, but with the kind of courage that only emerges when people stand together against those who would rule through intimidation. Here's the combined finale, parts 11 and 12. Final confrontation and resolution. The final confrontation came at dawn during the state championship rodeo finals. Federal agents had warned James that the remnants of the criminal network were planning one last desperate move. Their entire operation exposed, their power crumbling. They had nothing left to lose. "Multiple vehicles approaching," Tommy reported through the radio. "Black SUVs, heavily tinted windows, professional drivers, military precision." James watched from the command center as 4 vehicles surrounded the rodeo grounds. This wasn't a gang attack. These were professional mercenaries hired to eliminate evidence and witnesses with surgical precision. "They're targeting the servers," Deputy Chen warned. "All our evidence, all the documentation." But James had anticipated this too. 26 years of military service had taught him to always prepare for the enemy's final desperate strike. The servers they were after were decoys. The real evidence was already secured in multiple locations across 3 states. The strike team moved with professional efficiency, clearly ex-military. They disabled the visible security cameras, neutralized the regular police patrols, and systematically began taking control of key positions around the arena. "Sir," Tommy's voice crackled over the secure channel. "They've got Emma, using her as leverage." James watched through hidden cameras as the team's leader held Emma Murphy at gunpoint in front of the main office. His voice carried across the grounds. "Colonel Harrison, face me now, or she dies like her husband." But the mercenaries had made a critical mistake. They thought they were executing a precision tactical operation. Instead, they'd walked into a military-grade ambush years in the making. "Now," James commanded quietly. The response was immediate and overwhelming. FBI tactical teams emerged from concealed positions. Texas Rangers who'd been posing as vendors revealed themselves. Even the rodeo competitors, many of them veterans part of James's network, moved with practiced coordination to secure exits and protect civilians. The mercenary leader realized too late that his supposed hostage advantage was worthless. Emma Murphy, far from being a helpless victim, had played her part perfectly. The moment the team spun her around to face James, she dropped into a practiced crouch, giving the snipers positioned in the announcer's booth clear lines of fire. "Federal agents!" The command echoed across the grounds. "Drop your weapons!" The mercenaries, though professional, knew when they were outmatched. Their surrender was quick and efficient, exactly what James had expected from men who fought for money rather than conviction. As federal agents led the captured team away, James received one final message on his secure phone. "You have no idea what you've done, Colonel. Some powers can't be touched." But they were wrong. In the weeks that followed, the evidence they'd gathered systematically dismantled one of the largest criminal enterprises in rural America. Corrupt officials were arrested, illegal operations exposed, and communities across 3 states discovered they weren't alone in their fight against organized crime. Cedar Creek's transformation became a model for other towns. Emma Murphy turned the rodeo grounds into a training center for community defense and civic engagement. Deputy Chen was promoted to lead a new task force specifically targeting corruption in rural areas. Tommy Chen reopened his family's riding school, teaching a new generation that courage wasn't about fighting alone, but standing together. 1 year later, James stood at the renovated entrance of Cedar Creek Rodeo Grounds, watching families stream in for the new season's opening day. Children played without fear, competitors focused on their events rather than looking over their shoulders, and the community moved with the confident strength of people who knew they could defend themselves. "Think they'll ever try coming back?" Tommy asked, his limp less pronounced as he joined James at the gate. "Some might," James replied. "Criminals always test defended territory, but they'll find something they don't expect." "What's that?" "A community that remembers its strength. People who understand that real power isn't about fear or violence. It's about standing together, staying vigilant, and never backing down when justice is on the line." His phone buzzed one last time. Not a threat now, but a message from another small town asking for help dealing with their own corruption problems. James smiled, knowing that Cedar Creek's victory had started something larger than their own fight. Because in the end, the war hadn't just been about saving one town or exposing one criminal network. It had been about showing communities everywhere that they weren't helpless against corruption and intimidation, that with courage, unity, and the right leadership, any community could stand up and reclaim its soul. As the Texas sun set on another peaceful day in Cedar Creek, James Harrison knew his real mission was just beginning. There would be other towns, other battles, other communities needing to learn what Cedar Creek had discovered, that the strongest weapon against evil isn't guns or threats or violence. It's the unbreakable spirit of people who stand together, fight together, and refuse to let fear rule their lives. The war for Cedar Creek's soul was over, but its legacy was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.